Hello, and welcome to an episode of the Worldwide Mental Health Project. This is a project which I'm starting, which is going to share some of my experiences going through some very, very tough times in my life, and some of the lessons and some of the opportunities which I need to share. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about beliefs, decisions, and how they affect people. So basically, inside of a lot of communities, there's a structure which basically says that, you know, your beliefs form your decisions, and then your decisions form your actions, and then, you know, you go on for your result. I think there's something a bit more deeper than that, which is kind of been missed. Basically, there's three minds in your body. You have your heart, you have your mind, and you have your gut. Now, science tells us that there are nerve endings surrounded in all three. The one which has the least nerve endings is the gut. The one which has the most is the brain, and the one which has an intermediate is the heart. Now, when we combine all three, we're in alignment. Essentially, if you like to call it that, your energies are all aligned. Which is interesting. It basically means that you're moving towards the goal which you fundamentally believe with all your heart. You know, as what people would say. But essentially, it misses out on a couple of things. Basically, the thing that it misses out on is that in order to get to a point where you can change your beliefs, you can do a number of things. Basically, there's a couple of things that you can do. One thing that you can do is you can look at the end goal. And you can basically say, right, okay, work backwards and say, okay, well, do I see myself doing that sort of thing? The other thing that you can do is basically, you know, just get on with it and do the action. Perfectly fine, perfectly reasonable. And the other thing that you can do is, well, you can do something called opportunity cost. So what is opportunity cost? Well, basically, it's a bit like saying, you know, if I was to do this, I know that it wouldn't fail, would I do it, basically? That's the other thing that you can do. Now, for me, none of these three things particularly work. For me, it's more of a case of just understanding that, okay, well, this is kind of where I want to go, and this is where I need to go, and trying to get those things aligned. But because of the level of uncertainty, you run into fear. But here's the thing. The problem is, you basically observe your reality. So, like, you can't, what's the word I'm looking for? You can't be looking inwards when you are the one who's observing everything, if that makes sense. So in other words, you know how we say, like, you know, we need to look inwards and we need to observe ourselves. Well, we can't really do that because our eyes are looking outwards. In other words, our eyes aren't reflecting back into us to see what's going on. We are observing everything that goes on. So the problem that we have is that, well, if we're observing everything on the outside, we can't necessarily understand what's going on the inside anyway, which becomes a problem. So what do? Well, in the level of uncertainty, the only thing you can do is you can observe your experience through what you feel, right? Through what you feel. So if you feel nervous, then it probably suggests that something needs to be done, because without doing anything, you don't get anything. So what does that mean? It means that you can be driven to a desire to do something, and that desire can also lead you to take action. But because you're taking that action from desire, the problem now becomes, well, you're taking it from a place of expectation. And expectation is not the goal. Expectation is the result. So because of expectation, now we get into a problem. You know, we do one thing and therefore we expect to get another. So how do you break out of that? Well, the only thing you can do is basically say, well, I can only do something to the best of my ability, and I expect nothing in return. Okay. So if I'm not going to get anything in return, because I don't expect anything in return, do I get something? Good question. So if we go into Buddhist philosophy, yes, is the answer to that, because you're giving away freely, and therefore an effect happens whereby, don't give everything away freely, is what I'm saying. You're just giving away certain bits of information for free, and basically saying, right, okay, well, because I got this level of knowledge, now I can probably get paid to do something else, right? Which is related to what I did in the first place. And I think maybe that's the idea there. But again, it all depends. So I wanna be very clear about what I'm saying. Basically, when you're in the level of uncertainty, right, and when we see the uncertainty principles in science, one of the things that becomes apparent is how you observe the experiment. So what do I mean by this? Well, there's patterns within the data. For example, if you looked at the duality of light experiment, right? So if you look at light, if you look at it in a frame of reference, is a particle. Interesting, right? But if you look at light, like how we have here, this entire picture, right, that I have in front of me, you see that entire picture comes as a picture, right? When we say television, some people say tele-vision, yeah? But the thing is, right, when we look at this particular picture, it is the result of all those particles forming a coherence in which I can then process the information from what my brain perceives, right, which is perception. So perception plays a part in the way in which we experience life, right? Because if it didn't, I wouldn't be seeing what I'm seeing. See, this is where it gets funny. So when we talk about beliefs, then it goes back into the meaning of the perception which we see. So it is the meaning that we fundamentally see that I think within the data becomes a catalyst to a result of change. Yeah? It is the meaning that we have within the data. So for example, we look at AI. AI at the moment is quite a big threat to people in the industry at the moment in IT. Okay, that is true. But what does the data say? Right, the data says it's not as catastrophic as people think. Why? Because, the data suggests that we don't really have the data centers, we don't really have the energy. And if people are being displaced, then it comes up more catastrophic, because at the end of the day, people need that money to pay things like their mortgages, their bills, they need to pay their energy, they need to pay all of that stuff. So if the very people who are making that kind of money now have to default on their mortgage, for example, that affects banks, right? Now, if that affects banks, right, and they're carrying twice the amount of debt and they're carrying twice the amount of stuff, what does that mean? Well, they lose AAA rating. If they lose AAA rating, right, what does that mean? It means they can't sell off the debt. If they can't sell off the debt, what does that mean? It means the interest rises. When the interest rises, the entire system collapses. Right? So these are the kind of things that we get indoctrinated by. Why? Because people want to make money. Right? You can't blame them for it. They're still trying to survive like everybody else, but at the end of the day, indoctrination also changes beliefs, because it's changed the meaning. It's changed what we actually see, the perception within the data. Yeah. So when I say data in terms of people's lives, what I'm talking about is basically the patterns that we have observed throughout our entire careers, our entire love life, or our entire existence. The problem is that we can't necessarily observe that as somebody who's doing the observation, because we are the people who are living inside our own experience. So this is where people this is where it gets to the things of families and friends. Because with families and friends, what they can do is they can see it through a third-party lens, because they're observing you through a different lens, ones which you cannot see. In fact, it's written within Hindu scripture that this is one of the very, very things that is very, very elusive. I don't remember exactly who told me this. It was a guy on Instagram, but it's very, very profound. But basically, this is I think this is the only catalyst for change. Tony Robbins will say, well, you need to get out and do actions. I'm like, yes, but what does the action mean to the individual? It's not a case of just doing an action. Do an aligned action. This is where people go so wrong. Because this is the reason why when you see people, they have everything, but they feel so empty. Why do they feel empty? Because it wasn't an aligned action. That's why. Well, I talked about, right? The three minds of the body. The heart, the head, the heart, and the gut. Were not aligned. They were not aligned. This is why they feel restless. It's not a case of being poor or rich. It's not a case of being, being active. It's not a case of being, in or out of the universe or anything like that. The esoteric stuff, no. It's just a case of meaning, presence, values, and observation. I think once those 4 things fall into play, then you can make a change. But it's not easy. It's not easy because at the end of the day, there are certain restraints which come into play, right? There are certain duties that come into play. If somebody's got a family, a wife and kids, they are bound by duty as opposed to purpose. And therefore they sacrifice themselves in order to uphold that duty because perhaps the kids are young and the wife needs support. Therefore, under those pretenses, they are going to do what needs to be done, right? Which makes sense. However, if somebody is single, like myself, and are trying to build up their lives, then they are going to be more in terms of the, driven by the purpose. Because at the end of the day, they have time. So there are certain trade-offs that have to be made as well. And this is the very tricky thing about it. And I think this is where I go into that whole idea of we have to let go of expectation. Because if we expect something to happen, we're just left with more disappointment, and it rarely happens. And this is such an annoying thing, because in my time, the best things that have ever happened to me is when I've never observed the actual outcome. I was always neutral to the outcome. In other words, it was always at a time when I least expected an opportunity to happen, or I was least ready. And this is such a weird thing. I know there's people like David Baer out there who go into this a little bit, but I don't think it can be explained as simply as they say, like to understand the esoteric and quantum fields and all that kind of stuff. Like, no, right? Because if I look at the science behind it, even in the quantum fields, right? If we try, like, for example, like this picture behind me, right? If you were to perceive it, like I said, right? It's atoms and waves. But if I try and calculate like where specifically a light ray from the sun will hit on, for example, this car behind me, I can't do that as a human. I have to only make a predictable model, and that predictable model is so complex that a supercomputer actually does need to do the calculation. I can't do that as a human being. I can only predict where the light ray will hit. And that even goes for things like ray tracing. Right? We don't calculate, like, see, watch this, see? Here's another example. See, I have a ladybug right there. Right? This ladybug came from nowhere. I have no idea where this ladybug came from. Right? But this ladybug came and decided, out of all the possible possibilities of where to sit, it decided to land on my shirt. I'm not saying it's random. I'm not saying it's calculated. I'm saying it's from a probability out of multiple probabilities and possibilities within the universe, that at this point in time, at this moment, this is what's happened. So there's a certain level of presence that needs to be done inside of our decisions as well, right? And this is where meditation comes into play. So people say, oh yeah, well, I dismiss meditation. Well, you're dismissing meditation because at the end of the day, you don't want to sit with yourself and your thoughts and create a level of presence. And this is one of the reasons why I do these kind of videos, is, you know, saying that there's a sense of presence. So yeah, I hope that's been, you know, enlightening. I hope it's been interesting. I hope that's given you a bit of food for thought as well. You know, that actually, you know, what's needed for a change is a lot deeper than what a lot of people think, you know. And generally, it goes down to the meaning and the perception which you have. Once that's been controlled, then the fear factor can go away, because now you have an idea of what the commitment is. A bit more of an idea. You don't need to have the perfect idea, it just needs to be an idea, right? And the thing is, with the failure aspect, does it really matter? You know, like, this is the one thing that I've, you know, as somebody who's had a first-class degree, somebody who's gone to university, somebody who's done all of that stuff, one of the things that I'm quickly beginning to realize is that failure is the least of our worries. Like, failure is something that's going to happen anyway, right? You know, the average age for, like, I'm 33. The average age of a career switch in the UK is 39. 39 years old, right? So I didn't go through the best of times with that, right? I had lots of corporate shenanigans and stuff like that, and maybe I'll go into them in another video, but basically, you know, that kind of changed my life. That kind of basically said, right, okay, well, actually, you know, do I want this life? Do I want to be somebody who, you know, has to answer to other people as opposed to building out their dreams? And it's a tough question to answer, because when you're in that situation, you don't necessarily think of the dream. You think about other things, like the fear of, you know, money. You think about all this sort of stuff. And that's something that I'm learning to kind of detach upon. And I'll make another video about kind of why that is as well, because I think it's important to realize. And I think that's going to be my next video, is kind of like, what does money mean? And then we'll go into things like the psychology of money as well, because I think it's important, especially now, right? People are getting laid off left, right, and center from big tech, from stuff like that. And I think a bigger discussion is needed on that sort of subject. So yeah, I hope this video was useful. I hope you gained something from this video, and I hope that, you know, we can start a discussion and stuff. So yeah, let me know your thoughts about it. Like, let me know, you know, do you think, you know, it's generally meaning? Do you think there's more in terms of the belief? Did I miss something? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And yeah, I'll be happy to engage with them. All right, I'll see you soon.